and we'll get started, then I'll unmute you as we start. Okay, welcome back to Module 3 of our course. There's a couple things I wanted to go through this session. I was about to say this morning. It's morning for me, but it's even on the live session that we're recording. It's nighttime for some people, afternoon for other people, morning, and then even probably later than that for others. A couple of things that I want to talk about. First of all, we have our location here, which is aka.ms/SQL workshops. If you're just joining us in this particular recording or in this week's session, you definitely want to go back wherever you found this recording, because this may end up in a lot of places. Wherever you found this recording, start with the first one. I do an overview of the entire process, and then we're walking each module one at a time. So we're technically in Module 3 of the recordings, but we're actually going to be studying Module 2 today. So there's a couple things we want to go over. This is also a flipped class, and what that means is there's material you're going to study on your own, and then we're going over the results of your study in the first part, which we'll do when we start here in a moment. And then we'll also talk about, okay, now here's what you go need to learn. Now, I need to talk about that for a moment, because those of you attending live, those of you watching recording, this doesn't apply to you, but if you're watching live, we're doing this every single day in a week. You get 1 hour of instruction, and then I say, okay, here's all this homework. And as we talked about in the Module 2, which is really Module 1, because I start numbering at 0. Hey, I'm an old C programmer. So when we talk about that, some people interpreted, I think, that they were supposed to complete all of that homework last night. And it would be night for some of you and morning for others, and so on. As I pointed out in the very first overview when I introduced this workshop, if you followed every link and if you did every course, it would be several weeks of training. There is absolutely no way you would be able to do everything you saw in the previous module in an evening, even if that's all you did. And I'm making the assumption that you actually have work to do. And you actually have a life. I don't know. I don't have a life, but I'm assuming that your work balance is pretty full right now. So you're not intended to do all of this in an evening. There's just no way. It would be great if you had deployed your cluster so you could follow along. But what you're meant to do, and I've got a thing out there. If you just go out, I've got a whole bunch of things around learning to learn. But if you want to type seatbelt learning with Uncle, oops, I didn't spell Uncle correctly. Buck. So if you typed in seatbelt learning with Uncle Buck, you'll actually come to a blog location here. And I talk about how I do some learning in sort of the edges, right? How I find learning time here and there. So recommend you do that. I spend a little time each morning at work. I block it out. No, I don't have the time. No one does. But we spend at least an hour and try to get some learning in. If you just learn one thing, that's good enough. You know more than you did yesterday. So again, just to make sure we don't panic too much, you're not intended to grok all of this in an evening. Oh my gosh, especially the first module, Module 01, which was our second module. That is just absolutely a ton of information to sort of go through. All right, so just so we're clear there on what's expected, and no one's checking your homework. This is work for you to do and for you to understand. So how do you do it then? We've got this week we're doing, and if you're watching online, how do we learn this stuff? Well, the way you learn it is you spend a little time each day where you can, and you learn something, and then as you finish that up, you move on to the next module, but not until. So just watch what's going on here, but if you have not done the homework, don't panic. You'll be able to move along. So we'll talk kind of more about that as we go. So that's the process. For those of you that are watching it recording, and those of you attending live, can re-watch the recording, or maybe you don't even have to. Now you can take this totally by yourself. It looks like I'm getting some emails here. I probably should have shut that off, but we'll just live with the dings and so on. All right, here we go. We're on that site. We've gone to the Big Data Clusters Architecture course. In our first module, we did an overview. By the way, I'm running on a virtual machine on a Macintosh that's running SQL in Docker and Ubuntu Linux. So my system is a little overloaded at the moment. I'm also sharing my screen and sharing my video and everything else. So we're going to be a little slow today, and that's all right. You ask why? Why am I doing that? Well, I actually blew up my laptop yesterday. I have a large laptop and I have Minikube on it and I have a whole bunch of stuff. And somehow I've lost my networking layer. And I found that out just before I started this class. So quick like a bunny, I stood up the Macintosh and here we are. All right. So we talked about in the very first overview session what this workshop was. And again, I want to emphasize these are the things you're learning. These are huge. There are people who have Linux and that's only their job, and Kubernetes and that's their only job, and Azure and that's their only job. So this is a lot, and you're being asked to dive into all this. But this is how these things are flown together. We then talked about how you do your setup and your workshop details and so on. And after that, we went to our prerequisites. Now, I had you uninstall, I told you that there would be some issues. For those of you watching recording, the particular group of folks I'm talking to today are our support professionals. They're the people that deal with the really deep problems when things don't work. And so the first place that things don't work, especially in these earlier versions, is in the installation process, because a lot of things are being stood up. Now, I had you run a script in the last module that hides a lot of the complexity of what you installed. But not to worry, we're going to go through the installation sort of step by step in another module. Why would we do that later when we, well, I need to show you all the parts before you know why you're installing things in a certain order. But I need for you to be able to look at the parts, so you have to install it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that script that hid everything and the way to do it manually. And I'll even show you how to install this from inside the Azure portal. You can do everything in the cloud shell, it's called, if you want, and you don't have to install anything locally other than your management tools. All right, so we looked at our prerequisites. That's module 00. I started with an ordinal there, and I showed you how to do that. You got your Azure account, and then you set up your tooling, and we're going to be using all of that today. And one of the tools, or two of them, that you're going to focus on a great deal is a kubectl, K-U-B-E-C-T-L, stands for kube control, Kubernetes control. I call it kubectl, and people get a big kick out of that. And another program we've created called MS-SQL CTL, which will work with the actual components inside a Kubernetes cluster. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, and I call that the SQL cuddle, and people get a kick out of that. We'll also be using the Azure Data Studio and then an extension you need to install to work with it. Now, once you have those three things, you have all the client tools you need to work with the product. And today we're going to talk about the product. So what did we talk about yesterday, or whenever you watched the video or came to the course? Well, let's take a look. What we did was we began to work with the big data landscape itself. We talked about why you have big data. We talked about how you can use big data. And then we introduced our use case, which is Wide World Importers. They currently have an application that looks like this. But the company went out and said, you know what, we bought some more stuff and we want you to integrate it all. Very common. And some of this data we want to bring in, some of this data we want to leave where it is, and others we want to be able to walk across all of it and do things like machine learning or anything we do inside a typical database. All right. So I had you right away deploy on the Azure Kubernetes service, and we'll talk about where you can install SQL big data clusters later. That's in the installation module. But for now, we're doing it inside the Azure Kubernetes service. And if you installed all the prerequisites, and if your deployment worked, and raise your hand if it didn't work, because mine has also failed, you'll see that you've got some components within there, and we'll start talking those through. We then went through and talked about operating systems, because we're working with two now, Windows. probably on your laptop or whatever. And then now we're working with Linux, and you need to know a little bit about that. Now, perhaps you already know Linux well, and if you do, great. I actually started in Unix many years ago, and I started actually with Linux when it first came out. I used a distribution called Slackware. I don't know if that's still around. There's lots of distributions. In fact, we talked about distributions and so on. We talked about processing, we talked about file storage, we talked about memory, and then we talked about networking and the importance of doing that. And then we talked about Linux itself, and we went through the main things you need to understand and some of the commands you'll use. So I will assume today that you have reviewed those things and know what they are, or at least have a handshake with them so that we can go from there. After we looked at operating systems, we started looking at the way these things spread out inside a big data solution. And we're all very familiar with virtual machines, but they're quite large, and so we need something a little smaller. And so something called containers came along, and I explained how containers are different than virtual machines. From there, we needed a way to handle all of these containers that are roaming around, and this is with a product called Kubernetes. And so here we are. We talked about what Kubernetes is, and this is what you're going to see today. So we're going to bring all of these ingredients we were talking to, and I will point back and say things like, see, this is a node that the pod lives on that has the container that's running. And so I'll point to those and I'll say, and here's the persistent volume, and here's the frame. And so that's where all those things sort of come in. All right. So I talked to you about Kubernetes. There's a great deal more to learn, and then there's a little test for you to do that there. Then we talked about storage. Oh my goodness, we need to talk about HDFS, or the Hadoop Distributed File Storage, which is a distributed storage process, which will now be part of what you're going to learn in this module. So we've got lots of ingredients that are going on. And then, of course, now we need to talk about how do we look at all this. And so I talk a little bit here about kubectl, then we talk about SQLctl, then I talked about the tool, which we'll see today, which is the Azure Data Studio, and we'll also take a look at SQL Server Management Studio as we go through. We talked a little bit about Markdown and a little bit about Jupyter Notebooks. You should not have to care about those very much, but it's a good thing to learn and at least be familiar with. Some folks may be using notebooks to do their work, and you don't want to be surprised when they say, well, when I do this, here's what happened. You kind of need to know how those work. And I've given you lots of lessons to use those things, including the Azure Data Studio. All right. Then we talked about how you get data in a little bit. We're going to come back to this one. This is huge. Big data, and it's huge, right? Of course. So we're going to take a look at that. But at any rate, we take a look at some of these other ways to bring in data, BCP and SQL Server integration services and so on. But you have a myriad, just an absolute ton of ways to sort of do things. And normally you'll be streaming data in, or you may use something like the Azure Data Factory, and I use this a great deal. I used the Azure Data Factory when it was brand new. It was a little bumpy, but now, wow, really well done. And so there's a full description of that. And then when you start learning Spark, which we're not going to cover in great detail in this course, we'll have a corresponding course on programming big data clusters. And there we'll do things like machine learning services and app deploy and the Spark and so on. But here's a place where you can learn a little more about that if you're interested. So you don't have to spend a great deal of time here. All right, wow, that's a lot. And you were supposed to have all that done last night or this morning, along with work and along with your regular life. No, there's no way you could do that. So if you manage to deploy your cluster, great. I'll talk a little bit more about whether yours worked or not. Let's go see how mine's doing. I started one just a little bit. I see a lot of red, and I'm seeing lots of interesting things. Okay, here's the path and so on. Okay, I'm just going to put that down, just trying to see if my installation was working well, and that was just the MS-Ctl program. All right, now let's get to today's lesson, and then we're going to jump back and forth in these various tools. I'll make the assumption that you're either just going to watch what I'm doing here, or that your prerequisites installed correctly and that your cluster is up and running correctly. If all those things are true, then we'll get sort of started on the components. All right. So now we know all of the pieces that we need to run the components. So we are in module 02, which is really the third module. And recall that I said that the class, as I'm teaching it today, is on CTP, Customer Technical Preview 2.3. Actually, what's out right now is 2.4, and I haven't revised the course. The reason why is not enough has changed for me to make the bulk of this work, and I want this course to be quite stable. As time goes on, as we release more and more CTPs and then on to general availability, I will certainly revise the course up to production release. So once you've learned, it's a good idea to come back in here and just read over everything quickly again. And you're like, well, wait a minute, do I want to spend all this time learning now when this thing is going to change? Well, a couple of things. First of all, the big rocks, Kubernetes, Linux, networking, and so on, are not going to change. Spark, SQL, and so on. Those things are not going away. The fact that we're living inside Kubernetes, that's not going away either. So all of the work that you're doing now is transferable. So we're trying to make sure there's not a lot of things that you have to relearn. Not only that, the particular audience I'm speaking to today will be asked to support this the day it comes out, right? And then the customers pick up the phone and go, okay, I installed and it's not. And if it's the first time you've seen it, that's a little scary. So we want to get on this early. So that's kind of where we are. All right. As always, I say make sure you do the prerequisites. And this is what we're going to cover today. The SQL Server big data capabilities, the data virtualization piece, and then the cluster components, where we'll talk about data marts and data lakes. So let's start, first of all, with the 3 ways that you can use this product to work with large sets of data. Now, you'll recall yesterday that when I said once your cluster is up and running, it's just SQL. We talked about the master instance, which we'll see today. And when you hit it, you just hit it with SQL. Let me sort of prove that to you, assuming everything is still functional here. You can see I've got a master instance here, and I'm actually just hitting it with SQL Server Management Studio. Now, if you'll go to the very latest release, I don't know what version I'm on here. I think I'm on an older version. No, I'm on a fairly new, an 18 Preview 7. But if you do that, let's do this. Let's pop in here. Let's do a really difficult quick query here. Add version, a very difficult query. You can see I always follow my syntax. I teach school, and I have to make sure I always show good habits. So we just run the version, and assuming everything's okay, I usually color my connections so I know what I'm on at any one time, and assuming everything's working. And by the way, this is an artifact not of the SQL Server Big Data Cluster. It's actually an artifact of my virtual machine, which for some reason has slowed dramatically lately. I'm not sure what the deal is. We'll come right back to that because, again, I think that's actually the machine. But at any rate, when we talk about SQL Server, we're just talking about regular old everyday SQL Server 2019. Everything you're used to, machine learning services, all of those things are there. But there's 3 other advantages that this thing gives to you. The first is data virtualization, and we'll talk about what that means. It means basically using the Polybase engine, which we changed a great deal, to reach out and talk to another server and retrieve data from it and bring it back through Polybase so that the user at the end simply types in transact SQL statements, treating the external data as if it's a tabular data set, a table. And you're thinking, well, there's already lots of ways to do that. There's distributed queries, there's distributed servers. I mean, how many ways do we need to do this? Well, the interesting thing is that these Polybase tables actually have some logic and something called Polybase connectors. And I'm going to point you to some data to go read about that. Those Polybase connectors know what that destination server is. So for instance, if it's an HDFS and you create this external table, we'll see how to do that today. If you create that external table, what it will do is create a push down predicate so that HDFS runs the query, which will actually create, as we've now seen, a Hadoop job, which is actually in Java, and will push down, create a tabular data set, bring it back. That's all done on the Hadoop system. And then that's brought back through Polybase, and we talk directly to the user. So that data virtualization, quite powerful, and quite honestly, it's the #1 thing we hear. Now, what this allows us to do is we don't have to ingest the data in this case. We can simply leave it and go from there. But we also have the ability to keep that data if we wish, but store it locally. Now, we could just put it in one big database server and just make the database large, but over time, obviously, that's going to slow down. What's really needed is a distributed compute and a distributed storage over that data we've brought in from, let's say, Hadoop, and let's say Oracle and Teradata and. So if we have all those things bringing in data at that time, we may want to keep that. We'll talk a little bit more about why you would do that, but we like to call this a data mart. I've been around long enough to where we had operational data stores, ODS, and data lakes, and data marts, and data orgs, and data trough, lots of different statements. But we're calling this a data mart. And basically what that means is data fit for a particular purpose. From there, we may actually want to store even more data. We're going to go ahead. We got somebody typing there. We'll go ahead and mute that person. I think it's this person right here. Shravanai, I can't mute you for, there we go. Perfect. Keep you from, you see that commercial with the guy eating and they're in the conference call and you can hear him eating and they finally go, hey, Doug, would you turn your, So anyway, the SQL Server Big Data Cluster is what we call a data lake. In the big data cluster, we may want to bring large sets of data in, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get close to it. All right, let's talk first about the data virtualization. By the way, I wonder if my query ever finished or if I had a, oh, it looks like I had a problem. Let me try it again. Let me just run this again. Execute. Do it. Do it. I think I'm connected to the right instance. Yeah, there we go. I just must have fat-fingered something there. But you can see it's just regular old SQL Server, CTP 2.4, running developer edition 64-bit on Ubuntu Linux in this case. So that's kind of where we are there. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Okay, let's go through the course some more and get you started on these. So again, I'm just going to kind of walk through the course, but then we're going to take a look at some of these pieces as we move through. So as we're looking at what the components do, we got the data virtualization. We can see our SQL Server master instance. And within that, we can create an external table. And once we do that, it will then push out. We've got several connectors already written. One of them is HDFS. We also have Cosmos DB and MongoDB. We have Teradata, of course, SQL Server, and Oracle. I say, of course, SQL Server, but that was actually non-trivial. So these are currently built. Now, what does this mean? This means I don't have to install Aura Listener and the Oracle client software in order to get my work done. See, I can actually push down the query to Oracle without having the Aura Listener and so on. All right. So what I want to do in the course is show you that you can pop over here and go to the documentation. And you can see how to install the Polybase stuff there. Again, you don't have to install it. It's already installed, but it'll get you to there. Then you need the Oracle information for the JRE and explains how the HDFS Java jobs are created. Again, nothing for you to install in the BDC. These are done. These are the components that are using. All right. I say in the activity, and again, if your system is not up or if you don't have time, you don't have to do this, but I do give you some homework here where you run through these activities and it actually shows you how to create the data and the data pools. What I am going to do is sort of show you these examples and walk through them really quickly. So if you follow the instructions where it says to do the work, you actually have to install the sales database first, and we've got the instructions to do that. But you would use the database that's there, and then you would have copied some files, and I'll kind of show you where those are. In fact, let me let me pop over. I'm going to just pop over for a moment to a couple of clusters I've got running here. Let me connect to these and make sure they're still there. Make sure he's still there, and see if I can show you the locations there where they are. Let me close the cluster here. You've got locations, and here we go. You can see that there's an HDFS storage location. So this is the HDFS we learned about in the module yesterday, or whenever you watched the previous video. And you'll notice there's directories in here, and I can even make new ones. I'll just right click and say new directory, and perhaps I put in here customers. And what I can do now is inside this Spark cluster, I can begin to ingest text files into the customers directory. And we'll talk about how you do that later. But the point is, perhaps I've got a list of customers that comes from all my suppliers around the world, and I've got tens of thousands of them. And I wish to walk across those as if they are a table. And if I want to do that, I would put those files in. They all have the same format, but it can be a strange format, but it's got the same format, and I'm just dumping tens of thousands of records in this directory. And then all I have to do, let's go see the sample data here. I create an external file format. What is this doing? This is telling the system, what does that text file look like? And in this case, it's delimited. The field terminator is a comma. The string terminator is this. It starts after the first row. It's not using 0 like me. It's using the first row. And it's just taking a default type of a variant. So just something very open is what it's doing. So that doesn't try to apply numerics and dates and so on. So that's all it's done. So there's just a little file format that's sitting on my computer. Now, where is that sitting? Let's go take a look. All I have to do here is come out to, let's go to the BDC master instance here. Let me see if I can remember this password. I hope it's that one. Is it that one? I think it is. Once this opens, I'll show you. The reason I'm switching to a different cluster is I don't have these things created just yet. And so we see the databases here. And we come down, and you can see that inside the various databases themselves, let's go to sales. That's the one we're working with today. Let's take a look at these external resources. See that? There's the external file format we just created. And there it is. There's the CSV file, and that corresponds with this. That makes sense to everybody? Hopefully it does. All right. Then we need, in this case, we're going to potentially talk to, in this one, we're actually going to talk down to HDFS. So now I need to go say, I want to talk to that storage pool. We talked about those in the overview, and I'll show you those again in a moment. So here they are, and it just creates that. Notice it says, go to the HDFS in the controller and the service master pool. What is all this? I'll come back to this in a moment, but the name of it is SQL storage pool. So where is that? Let's go take a look. In the storage pool, I come here, and you can see there it is, SQL storage pool. And so that creates that. All right, now that I've done that, I can simply say, I'd like an external table called this, and it happens to live here, and it happens to be in this directory on that particular storage pool. So all that being said, now what I can do is I can come see my tables. And inside Management Studio, we've put them under a tree called external tables. And you can see, there it is. There's the external table. Let's go for broke here. Let's select. I haven't used this cluster in a little while, so hopefully I haven't deleted anything. Different color, so I know I'm on the right one. Hey, look at there. So what it did was it ran down to the HDFS and found all that. Now, where is all this stuff? I mean, we're looking at these various things here. Where is all this stuff? Let's get back to our lesson, and we'll go through some more. So let's talk about where these things are living. Oh, here we go. Remember this diagram we had? Number one, we've got the Kubernetes cluster, and we're good with that. That's just lying around the outside here. Let me scroll down just a bit till we get everything in full view. And then these things here are conceptual: control plane, compute plane, and data plane. They're just concepts. They're just tags. So we're not worried about those. These, we remember, are nodes, right? We know what nodes are. And inside the node, we have things running. Now, there's a very special node called the Kubernetes Master, and it's basically a service that's running all the time that controls everything. And then we talked about these little guys, and they are pods. And inside a pod is one or more containers, and they're running something. So the first container or pod or node that we've been hitting is just this SQL Server Master. So that's this guy here. So that's all we've been talking about so far. But we did see this concept down here, the storage pool that I showed you just a moment ago. That's right here. Here's the HDFS. All three of these are pods. They happen to be pods in here. And these are the files that we saw that live in there. So we created on the SQL Server Master database a virtual table that can talk to the storage pool, because we created that, which can talk to HDFS. So now people simply query this, go through here, talk to here, and talk to here. That's the way it's hanging so far. So it'd be great if we could see all these in one place. I mean, this is conceptual, and in fact, this is sort of wrong. If you start thinking about this, this isn't accurate, because the Kubernetes cluster can be made up of any number of nodes. They can be stood up or torn down. Within those nodes, the pods can actually move around. I've got them static here just so you get the idea. But in fact, on my cluster, and if you followed the procedure for your own cluster, all of these are living on one node. We put everything in one node. Oh my goodness, that seems a little messed up. So how do we do this? Well, let's get back to our documentation and we'll see. We talk about the first thing, which is the control plane. And that's this right up here, this control plane, and it holds the following items. I'm going to walk through those items, and then you're going to go through the storage, and I'm going to show you where they are, and then I'm going to do that for each of our components. Let's start out with the control plane. In the control plane, we have the Kubernetes Master. You don't really talk to it. You talk to the service of Kubernetes, and it will handle everything else. So there's no interface we expose here. But there is an interface we expose on the SQL Server Master. Now, how do you find that? Interesting. You find that by simply asking, and by the way, I've got all your links here of where everything is. What you do here to find it, let's go to our install and our get started and our install. Let's do this right here. I should have had this up. My apologies. You get to see me wander around here. But basically, you're going to, let's do this. I'm trying to find, there's a list of things. It's in the documentation, actually, or rather in the class. But you're going to be reading the class sort of on your own. The big things you're going to care about are this one, the SQL Server Master instance, and then how you get to the rest of the cluster. There's those two things. Let me see if it shows. Yes, that's what I was looking for. So we're going to use a kubectl command that will get the service called Endpoint Master Pool. What in the world is that? This is your master instance. And then the -n, and in our case, if you deployed the defaults, it's going to be SQL Big Data, I think we called it. So that's the name of the service we deployed. What is this thing? This thing right here is this thing right here. And yes, that's all documented, and I'll show you in your training as well where that's documented. But if I go get that, it will provide me two things, a TCP/IP address and a well-known port. Now that port happens to be, let me pop over here. Let's go get my class master instance here, and I'll just show you what it looks like. This is a great place to show you. When I ran that command against this cluster, I got this back, and then a tab over, and then this. This should look quite familiar to you, 1433, right? But we simply prepend a 3 to that, so you find the thing. You'll then get a password, a name and a password that you entered when you installed. And once you do that, now this is just regular old SQL. This is the master instance. All right, so what about the other one? How do we get to it? Well, exactly the same way. You get to it exactly the same way, and there it shows you exactly what I've just showed you. The way you get to the other one is to connect to this one is kubectl, once again, get service name. This is the other piece you need to care about, and it's called endpoint security. Once again, -n for the name of the service or cluster, and then here we called it SQL Big Data Cluster, and that's how that works. All right, so once you do that, where do you put that? Well, you can put it in a couple of places. The first is, if you're in the Azure Data Studio tool, you can add a new server. Here it is. I didn't know where my own icons were. And if you pick SQL Server, you would simply, that's where you put the one that's got 31433, right? And then if you want the Knox gateway, you use this one right here. And then you simply type in the name of that. You put in the username that you used when you installed and the password you used when you installed. Now, I made a particular server group, so I'm going to cancel here. And then it shows up like this. And that's how you get to the Knox endpoint. Interesting. Okay, and now I've got both my things, my class master instance and my class Spark cluster, and I can right click and manage those, and I can do things with those, and so on. So you've got all kind of stuff that you can do when you get to those. All right, but that's what those two are. Once more, let me tie this back out for you right here. That one, the 31433, that's this guy. And the other one, the service master endpoint, is right here. All right, let me show you where those are again. So this one, kubectl endpoint security, that's this guy. And Knox gateway gets you to everything else. And then the first one that we saw, which is called, let's see if I can find it, here we go, Endpoint Master Pool, that guy right there, that is this. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And then I'm going to show you some things here in just a moment. Again, we're not doing the whole course, it's a flipped class, so you're going to be looking at these things later. All right, so that's where those two first things are. Now within that, there's a few pieces that we need to think about. First of all, there's a controller service. Now we've laid down a controller service that gets you to the stuff you need to get to. And if you look at this, I explain what the controller service does. This sort of manages the cluster from the SQL Server perspective, but it's a tad larger than the SQL Server cluster component or SQL Server master instance itself. It does a lot of things, including monitoring tools. The monitoring tools. Back up here, you can see that we've got some monitoring tools we've laid down. That's this node I'm representing right here. Once again, everything's on one node for me, but it's represented here. All right, what are these monitoring tools? And I know we're feeling a little scattered right now. That's okay. I'm going to bring it all back together in just a moment. But this portal right here you get to, once again, with a kubectl command to ask for the proper location, you'll get a TCP IP address, and then you simply use portal, and that's all documented, so you don't have to guess at any of this. It's all in your documentation here. But when you do that, this will be using, this is the controller service, it will be using two open source components, Grafana and Kibana. What in the world? Well, let's go to that portal. Here's one. I've got one running right now, and this is what it looks like. Now we're beginning to see all of the pieces coming back together. Look, here's our deployment itself. We have our controller that I've just mentioned. We've got our SQL Server master instance. We've got our compute pool. Where's that? Let's go back and see. That's right here, right? And then we've got our storage pool. Where's that one? That's right here, storage pool. We've got our data pool. Where's that one? That's right here, data pool. And then we've got our app pool, which is right here. We haven't talked about app pool yet. We'll talk about that later. Now look, inside of those, I've got various pods. We talked about what pods are. Aha, now things are coming, right? So we've only got one node in our cluster. That happens to be what we've done, but we've got these various pods. So you can see that this doesn't map, unfortunately, very well to this, because it looks like inside this particular one, I have 9 pods in that controller. They probably correspond to all of these things that you can see running in here, right here. But I've got 9 of those pods. I've got 1 pod in the master instance and 1 pod in the compute pool and 2 pods in the storage pool and 2 pods in the data pool and so on. And I haven't deployed any applications, so there they are. Well, that's very useful to see. We can see our entire deployment here, and you can see what I've called it, and here they all are. And here's actually how they were deployed. You can actually click the YAML, yet another markup language, and you can see everything that was done to make those true, and you can see the pod names. This is very interesting as we begin to go through this. Next, we can see the service endpoints. And I was talking about those endpoints and how do you find those? Well, here they are. Our master one for my instance is right here, and it's at this port. So that's how I connect. For my controller, if I wanted to go through that, I would go here. If I wanted to go through the Spark gateway, I'd go here. And if I wanted to see my Spark management or my yarn, we'll do that later, I would go here. So I've got all the TCP/IP addresses I need here. And then I can also now look at the controller itself and see how it's doing. And it looks like the portal's world itself are doing pretty good. And here's my master instance, compute pool, storage pool, data pool, and application pool. So let's take a look at this. We've got the master instance, and I see what it does. It actually provides SQL Server, it's got machine learning, and it's got the Polybase in it. That's what that does. Here's what it's called, but we already know that because we read our documentation. Here's how long this one's been running. It's currently running, which is a good thing. It has not had to restart, and you may see these things restarting periodically, and you're like, oh my gosh, that may be absolutely normal. If you have some high restarts, that could be a problem. The thing is, the users shouldn't even notice. Once again, as the pods come up and down and reconnect to the storage, you're in good shape. And you can actually see which node it's on. You'll see that all of mine are on one node, and yours will be too, unless you deployed more than one node. Here's what's interesting. This is why I wanted to show you this. Do you see this node metrics, SQL metrics, and logging? You see these? These two guys right here, these, or ladies, these two ladies right here, we'll use it that way, are actually here. Grafana. So when I click one of these two links, I'm actually going to spin off to this tool here called Grafana. When I click this tool, the logs one, I'll actually spin off to a tool called Kibana. Now, for those of you on this call and in this particular lesson today, this may be the most important thing you learn because you'll be in here quite a bit. So we go to the cluster administration, and I'm going to click this one. This is the node metrics. So these are the counters and so on for the particular node this is on right now. This is from the Kubernetes and sort of Windows, if you will, perspective. It's actually Linux, but it's collecting all of this. Think of this like Performance Monitor, if you will, and we'll click on that and let me let you see it. I'm actually a huge fan of Grafana and Kibana. We've written some counters and visualizations that you'll see here, but you can actually make more. This is highly configurable. Usually in the class at this point, I say, raise your hand if you've seen this before. And 1 or 2 people have seen it, and a couple others lie because they don't want to look like they've been left out. But a lot of people have never seen this before. But you can come in here quickly and see the processes and the memory usage. And as you hover over things, you get a really rich set of information. So I'm hoping today, if your cluster deployed, you'll immediately go right in here and begin to play with your Grafana view. Now, this is on the metrics we have bundled up at Microsoft for the node. We also have bundled up some SQL metrics. So this would be like perfmon counters, but you have actually tied out the SQL counters you care about already. and they'll come up sort of in here. And so here we're doing our traditional transactions per second and batch per second and wait statistics and so on. You can see, there you go. I was about to make an excuse for the slowness of this. I'm using a one node cluster, super bad idea. You would never do that in production, but it's cheap. It's easy and much less expensive than the other. And you can see that you can move around and see all the batches and so on. Very rich set of information, and yes, you can export this stuff and so on. But if you're looking for a textual view of what's going on, we'll now switch over to Kibana. And inside Kibana, we're going to view the logs. Now, this tool has a full searchable set of logging and so on. Now, depending on the Kubernetes service you're running, whether you're doing it locally or you're using some other provider, or you're using something like we are, which is Azure Kubernetes service, you'll actually have yet another set of logging that you could use, because I know some of you right now are going, hey, wait a minute, this is on Azure. Why aren't we using, just wait, it's fine. It's just taking its time. And I think also, as I mentioned, my VPC is not running excellent as well. While that's running, and it's really well done. Oh, here it goes. But while that's running, let me pop back over. And if you come into your resource group, where you have your where you've created your big data cluster on the Azure Kubernetes service, if you click into that that group, we'll come back and show you a few more things in here. But you can actually see the cluster running, the Azure Kubernetes cluster running. And when you do, there's a panel that will show up. Once again, I apologize for the slowness. There we go. There's a couple buttons here that say Monitor Containers and View Logs. These are like Grafana and Kibana, but for the Azure Kubernetes service. So depending on what level you want to monitor at, if you need a fine grain, you're going to be in Grafana, Kibana inside the controller. But if you need to go back up to the service level and see how it's doing, you would click here. Now, this does use Performance Insights from Azure. And when you click this, you'll get an initial button that says, I need to store this stuff somewhere, give me a storage account name and all that. So I've already done that. And then when you're done, what it will do is it will pop up both the logs and, in this case, the graphical. So this is similar. And I'm just burying my machine, apparently. There's the logs, by the way. And there's dashboards and timelines, and you can extend this guy, and it's insane what you can do in Kibana. I'm a real big fan. Again, yet something else to learn, right? But the neat thing is you got to them from here. Let me see if my log, there it is. So once again, it's asking me here to enable my Azure monitoring. So I would click the enable button. I won't wait for that to stop, but it's going to bring up a very similar look, although not nearly as pretty as the Kibana and Grafana. And then you'll be able to negotiate and see the logs. You would see the same thing, how many nodes and so on. This is for the Kubernetes service in Azure. This doesn't have to do with the cluster administration that we see sort of here. All right, we've jumped around a bit. Let's get back to the course so that I can kind of get you back. All right, what have we seen? Well, we've seen so far that we stand up a Kubernetes cluster, and you happen to do that in the Azure Kubernetes service. That's the bar here around the outside. When we did that, the mscuttle command, and it stood up, by the way, one node, because we told it to do that, and that node has within it already built in Kubernetes. So that's just part and parcel, and it's got Docker runtimes and so on. So that's there. We then use the mscuttle command. So the kubectl command is how you interface with Kubernetes. The mscuttle command is the deployment tool that Microsoft uses that will deploy a Kubernetes, very similar to Helm, if you're familiar with that, Helm. We've just sort of pre-bundled everything with all of our YAML files that say we want this many pods, and they need to do this, and they need to have this networking, and there are these kinds of claims to these kinds of storage. All that's bundled within the mscuttle command. Those lay down all of the black and orange boxes that you're seeing. So Once we lay that down, we tag them right away with control, compute, and data plane, and that's a virtual tag. It's not a real tag, it's a virtual tag that we're talking about here, just mental. So those things, the first thing we lay down is one of these, and you probably say, waiting for controller service to come up, waiting for controller service to come up, waiting for controller service to come up. That's the controller part that is in right here. So he's the first person that stands up is the controller. Once the controller is up, then it begins to lay down the SQL Server master, which it did in here, the master instance. Then it begins, well, first it lays down all these monitoring services, right? And you can see it's using Elasticsearch and InfluxDB, and it's using the Grafana and the Kibana and networking and something called Telegraph. All these little tools that it uses just to stand up and control itself. Once it does that, it will stand up the master instance. It actually doesn't take that long. It's pulling the image for the pod that actually takes a little while. From there, it will lay down the compute pool, and then the storage pool, and then the data pool, and then the application pool. And again, it just carves those out, and as they're called on, it begins to spin up pods. So hopefully now that begins to make a little more sense. So this gets laid down first, this gets laid down second, and then these come in at various stages, and you'll see them when you're doing your install. So now when you tear down your cluster and you redeploy, you'll see what's happening, or you'll know what's happening because of that. So hopefully that's useful. All right, let's walk through the course now and talk about the different ways you can do this. You can install Kubernetes in 3 places. The first is, and by the way, we're writing on these various layers, right? So we've got operating systems, and then Docker, and then Kubernetes that's using Docker, and then we've got all of our stuff, this big data cluster that we lay down inside. So as you can see, they're all riding inside of this Kubernetes cluster. So where can that be? And you have 3 places that we're supporting right now. First, you can do it in Azure Kubernetes Service. You can do that for both testing, development, and even production. That could be a good place to do that. Secondly, you could install it on premises, and we use a tool called kubeadm, and there's information about how you do that. And once you install with kubeadm, and we'll talk about that in the installation process later. Once you install in kubeadm, that's if you've got computers in-house. And you can do those virtually or physically. Kubernetes actually doesn't care. It needs the name of a computer, and it will take over from there. You can also install on something called Minikube, and I actually installed this yesterday after our course because my deployment wasn't working well. I wanted to make sure I was ready for this morning, so I installed a Kubernetes Minikube on here. And what this will do is it runs everything inside a virtual machine, all of it, all of Kubernetes, all of Docker, everything. But it looks like it's a big, gigantic Kubernetes cluster. It needs a lot of room. I've got a 64 gig laptop here. It needs wheels to roll it around. And it's got a lot of space on the hard drive. But somehow I managed to mess up my networking layer this morning. I was working great yesterday. That's how we taught the course, but not so much today. So I'll fight that later. I had to jump on the other system. All right. And those are the 3 ways we support the install. We will support others later. We may get to a point where we say, hey, look, as long as your Kubernetes is running, good. But I'm not sure where we'll be with that just now. Okay, we'll talk more about that when we talk about our install. Once again, we talk about what's in the control plane, and just for your information when you go out to do your class homework, whenever that is, doesn't have to be tonight. Here's everything you need to know about the Kubernetes components and how those work, and you can go into depth. A lot of this stuff you may just bookmark so you can come back to it later. I talk about Nox, Livy, Hive, Grafana, and Kibana. All of them worlds on their own where you could go learn things. The next thing we talk about is the controller service, and I showed you that, and it shows you how to get to that. And once again, there's a link you can go learn. Then we talked about the master instance, and I explained what's inside that, and I've got a couple of places for you to go learn more about that. Next, we talk about the compute pool, and I explain a little bit more about the compute pool, then the application pool. And then I go through each one of these and begin to break down how each one of these works individually. So I highly advise you go through this. Now, All you have to do, the homework for tonight, if you want to do it, is simply review one article. How's that? I thought I'd be easy on you. You're supposed to, I teach college, and what you're supposed to do is give a lot of homework at first so that you look really mean, and then give less homework as you go on so that everybody likes you at the end. I don't know if that was intentional here, but normally, no, that's not intentional. The other module we learned in just 1 hour yesterday, or when you watch the other one, is usually the longest portion of the day when we teach this course full out. But this explains, all you have to do is just sort of read through this, and it just explains how to bring things in one step at a time. And it's right from the documentation, so it's very easy to do. If you'd like to do more, I've got a lot more things you can look at here. This white sheet is awesome. Definitely check it out. And we did a session on this at Ignite last year. It's a little dated, but the information is largely good. It looks very similar to the overview I did for you. Now, in the next installment, we're going to take a look at the planning, installation, and configuration. And assuming all is well, I will show you step by step how I deploy right from the portal, just using the portal bash shell. That is assuming, of course, I can do that. But even if it doesn't work, I'm going to go through the process with you so you can see it. But we're going to talk all about where these things can go, and we're going to cover that in the next session. So you've been greatly patient with me. You've been greatly patient with yourself. Don't panic. Do the work as you have time. If nothing else, get exposed to it all, come back around and pick up the sections as you need to. So I will see you in the next module. If you're watching online, don't binge watch. Go out and do the work, at least some of it, so that you're comfortable with these things. I'm going to leave you with the cluster administration portal and the overview just one more time so you can kind of visualize what we've been talking about. Hopefully now this and the diagram are starting to mesh. Tomorrow they'll mesh some more. And in the next video after that, they'll mesh some more. And in the last one, they'll mesh some more. So hopefully everything will be able to work for you. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Pradeep, if you'd like to stop the recording now and come off of mute, you can. And if any of you want to yell at me, where's Stacey?